On April 8, 1943, with the sky over Caen, France as clear as polished glass and the altimeter fixed at 27,000 feet, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermican allowed a smile to surface beneath his oxygen mask. From the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 198-5, he watched several bulky shapes laboring upward toward his patrol, heavy silhouettes, awkward in appearance, brightened by the high-altitude sun. The ace of Jägerschwader 26, only 26 years old, studied the new American fighters preparing to enter combat over occupied Europe for the very first time. "They're sending us flying tin cans," he joked over the radio to his wingman, amused by the effort with which the Thunderbolts clawed their way upward. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group climbed in tight formation, pushing their Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engines to the limit in order to lift nearly 7 tons of aircraft into the thinning air. To German eyes they looked clumsy and overweight, rounded fuselages topped with broad canopies, wings that seemed undersized for such mass, and propellers larger than anything the Luftwaffe had ever fielded. What none of the circling German pilots knew, as they closed in like wolves, was that these comic-looking machines would soon dismantle the Luftwaffe's fighter arm piece by piece. Within 18 months, the same aircraft being mocked would instill dread in anyone who heard them coming. 8 synchronized Browning .50s capable of unleashing thousands of rounds per minute, their firepower enough to tear a Messerschmitt apart in seconds. The arithmetic of destruction was already stored in those wide wings, more than 3,000 rounds and a blistering rate of fire that redefined lethality. The turning point began that April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commanding officer of the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation maneuvering into position. A former Eagle Squadron pilot who had recently transitioned from RAF Spitfires, Blakesley understood a truth his men had not yet learned: survival in the Thunderbolt required abandoning familiar doctrines. The P-47 was not built for the traditional dance of turning combat. While German design favored light, nimble interceptors, Republic aviation had followed an entirely different path, one that relied on mass, endurance, and overwhelming firepower. That day, scattered across the French sky, 56 American pilots faced their first real test. Many would eventually become aces, their names etched into the history of aerial warfare. But on April 8 they were simply newcomers in an unfamiliar machine, confronting the most battle-hardened fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939, carrying the experience of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The Americans had been at war for exactly 1 day. This is a story of how industrial capacity eclipsed tactical finesse, how quantity fused with quality to create crushing superiority, and how the sound of 8 Brownings firing in unison transformed mockery into fear. The Thunderbolt had been conceived during the Panic of 1940, when the Luftwaffe swept across Europe and the U.S. Army Air Corps urgently requested a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching Germany's best. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, responded with a blueprint unlike anything that had come before. "It will be enormous," he admitted to his team, "but it will be well balanced." The XP-47B prototype, which first flew on May 6, 1941, stunned everyone who saw it. Its empty weight nearly doubled that of its predecessor, while the elaborate turbo-supercharger system, its pipes and ducts weaving through the rear fuselage, gave the aircraft a distinctly swollen look. Test pilots often voiced the same first reaction: does this thing really fly? But at altitude, it became something entirely different. The R-2800 engine held full power above 27,000 feet, where many German fighters began to struggle. The exhaust-driven turbo-supercharger allowed the P-47 to behave as if it were still flying at sea level. The aircraft was not immediately embraced. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, oversaw a brutal training period marked by crashes, runway ground loops, torque-induced rollovers, and dives so fast that pilots encountered aerodynamic compressibility for the first time. In those early months, the Thunderbolt claimed more American lives in training than German pilots would in the early battles. But those who mastered it found something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, later one of America's top aces, described his first flight simply. "You didn't fly it. You aimed it." The power was unbelievable. The encounters of April and May 1943 initially seemed to confirm every German suspicion. The P-47s were incapable of matching the Focke-Wulf 190 in a turn, nor could they climb with the Messerschmitt 109 or imitate its quick, responsive handling at medium altitude. Luftwaffe pilots were quick to exploit these flaws. They attacked from below, where the heavy American fighters labored the most, and tried to drag the Thunderbolts into turning contests where agility, not raw power, decided life or death. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, commander of Jägerschwader 26, summarized his first impressions in a blunt report to headquarters. "The new American machine is built for butchery. It handles like a truck, turns like a freight locomotive, and climbs like an overfed cow. Our pilots call them fat Indiana wagons pretending to be fighters." Early statistics seemed to justify the German disdain. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 P-47s while claiming only 3 confirmed victories. British RAF pilots watching from their Spitfires quietly wondered whether the Americans had chosen the wrong tool for the job. UK squadrons joked that the best evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was to unstrap and run around in its spacious cockpit. Yet beneath those early failures, something unusual was happening, something German intelligence overlooked. The P-47s that went down had endured astonishing levels of damage before finally succumbing. One Thunderbolt returned from a mission on May 4 punctured by 21 cannon hits and over 100 machine gun impacts, damage that would have shredded a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire into fragments. Its massive air-cooled radial engine, with no fragile coolant system to rupture, simply kept turning where liquid-cooled fighters would have flamed out. More importantly, when a Thunderbolt did manage to line up its guns, the effect was devastating. The concentrated fire from 8.50 caliber Brownings created a zone of destruction unlike anything German pilots had faced. Earlier fighters carried rifle-caliber guns or cannons with only a handful of shells. The P-47 could sustain heavy fire for half a minute, an eternity in the sky. Perceptions began to change on June 26, 1943, over Lisieux, France. The catalyst was Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, and an encounter that would later become legendary in both Allied and German accounts. Johnson was flying in a formation of 48 P-47s returning from escort duty when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from 2/JG-26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of Adolf Galland, pounced from above. The Germans executed a flawless sun attack, diving with far greater speed. Johnson, flying at the rear, was trapped in the overlapping fire of several attackers. Within seconds, his Thunderbolt was torn apart. 21 20mm shells detonated across the airframe. The canopy exploded. Hydraulic fluid sprayed through the cockpit. The engine cowling ripped away. Flames flickered beneath the instrument panel. Shrapnel sliced into Johnson's nose and leg. He tried to bail out, only to discover that a 20mm round had warped the canopy track, welding it shut. At 27,000 feet, bleeding and half-blind, he was sealed inside a dying aircraft. What followed defied established beliefs about structural limits. With the windshield painted black by oil, the engine shaking violently, and the controls responding erratically, Johnson somehow leveled the Thunderbolt and pointed it toward the English coast. The aircraft stayed airborne under conditions that should have reduced it to falling wreckage. Then fate intervened again. A solitary FW-190, piloted by an as yet unidentified flyer from 2/JG-26, found the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at barely 170 miles per hour. Historians have suggested several possible names, but no definitive identification exists. What happened next became one of the most astonishing duels in air combat history. The German fighter slipped behind Johnson and opened fire with 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. Johnson, unable to maneuver, crouched behind the armor plate and waited for death. The Thunderbolt soaked up the entire cannon load. The German reformed, attacked again with only his machine guns, and emptied those as well. Out of ammunition, he pulled alongside. Johnson could see him clearly, a young blonde pilot staring in disbelief at the ruin that somehow remained airborne. His expression shifted, from confidence, to confusion, to something close to fear. The German gave a small, almost respectful salute, rolled away, and departed. Johnson coaxed the shattered P-47 back to Manston, where the engine died the moment it touched the runway. The crew chief stopped counting holes after reaching 200. One shell had burst inches from Johnson's head. Another struck the armor plate behind his seat. The engine had taken multiple direct hits. Control cables were partly severed. 3 of the 4 fuselage longerons, its structural spine, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had carried him home. The survival of Johnson's Thunderbolt shocked both air forces. American engineers examining the wreck realized they had underestimated the monster they had built. German intelligence, receiving reports from Jägerschwader 20 SIXS 2nd Staffel, initially dismissed them as impossible. But witness statements from multiple pilots confirmed the unbelievable. The American, flying truck, could withstand punishment no European fighter could begin to survive. The Thunderbolt had absorbed everything the Luftwaffe's best fighters could deliver, and survived. By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to exploit the P-47's true strengths. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, discovered the key through brutal trial and error. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, once considered a crippling disadvantage, became a weapon. In a dive, nothing could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve, even in a full vertical dive. That speed could then be converted into altitude during a zoom climb, leaving pursuing fighters helplessly behind. Captain Walker, Bud Mahiran, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, developed what came to be known as the boom and zoom tactic, though pilots jokingly called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Instead of maneuvering in classic dogfights, P-47 formations climbed to 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters could operate effectively. When Luftwaffe aircraft appeared below, the Thunderbolts rolled inverted and dove, reaching speeds that made defensive shooting nearly impossible for the Germans. At the bottom of their dives, the American heavy machine guns unleashed a storm of fire. German pilots who survived described it as facing a wall of lead. Anything caught in the convergence zone didn't merely fall, it disintegrated. The true revelation of American firepower came on August 17, 1943, during the dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest American bombing penetration into Germany attempted so far. The mission exposed both the P-47's limitations, its range, even with drop tanks, and its devastating effectiveness when used correctly. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, intercepted a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-110, Zerstorer, heavy fighters preparing to attack the B-17s with cannon and rockets. The twin-engine 110s, heavily armed but lacking maneuverability, were the Luftwaffe's specialist bomber killers. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. Gunner Heinrich Roth, aboard one of the Bf-110s, later recalled in a POW interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters, good hits. I saw them strike the fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from the fuselage, the tail severed, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds a 110 became nothing. 8 Bf-110s were destroyed in less than a minute. German pilots had never witnessed such concentrated firepower. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At the typical 300-yard convergence distance, All 8 guns intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet across, delivering 100.50 caliber projectiles per second, each traveling 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself was a testament to American industrial might. While German fighters often carried only 120 to 200 rounds per 20 mm cannon, American pilots could maintain continuous fire for over 30 seconds. Standard ammunition belts mixed armor-piercing incendiary, API tracer, and ball rounds, designed to both penetrate and ignite. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, later the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect. "When you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw 109 literally cut in half, the tail falling one way, the nose and wings another. The pilot never knew what hit him." By September 1943, the Luftwaffe discovered another frightening truth about the P-47. Its performance improved with altitude, while theirs deteriorated. The turbo-supercharged Pratt and Whitney R-2800 maintained full power up to 30,000 feet. German fighters with single- or two-stage mechanical superchargers lost significant performance above 25,000 feet. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's greatest aces with 206 victories, encountered this reality fatally on October 8, 1943. Leading Jägerschwader 1 against AB-17 formation at 28,000 feet near Bremen, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 sluggish in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, powerful at medium altitudes, struggled for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove from 32,000 feet, the German fighters were sitting ducks. Robert Johnson, now an experienced pilot on his way to ace status, spotted Philipp's distinctive aircraft. "Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed." Philipp's death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If one of their finest, a man who survived more than 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, couldn't survive against the Thunderbolts, what chance did average pilots have? The German High Command ordered an immediate investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was sobering. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor included a 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, a 1/2-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and armored deflection plates surrounding the engine. Most alarming to the Luftwaffe, its rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 ordinary fighters and still make it home. In January 1944, a new P-47 variant began arriving in England, one that would complete the transformation from laughingstock to nightmare. The P-47D-22 featured a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller, a 13-foot diameter paddle blade system with broadchord blades that bit into the air like massive oars. The improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had struggled with an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, the paddle blade versions achieved 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. The huge propeller also improved acceleration, allowing the P-47 to build energy rapidly in level flight. Hauptmann Heinz Nock of Jägerschwader 1, a veteran of over 200 missions, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. He wrote in his combat diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart, nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller did more than boost performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt. The distinctive roaring thunder produced by blade tips approaching supersonic speed could be heard for miles. German ground troops reported identifying P-47s by sound alone, a deep, threatening rumble that meant death from above. They began calling it Donnerschlag Thunderclap. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. A typical loadout carried two 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, extending the aircraft's range to more than 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade prop's improved performance even when fully loaded, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after jettisoning their tanks. The Luftwaffe's response was to focus on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to halt the American daylight offensive. But reaching the bombers meant pushing through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal task. German pilots developed a grudging respect, bordering on fear, for the big American fighters. Major Gunther Rall, one of Germany's greatest aces with 275 victories, most on the Eastern Front, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944 that left him badly wounded. In a post-war interview he recalled, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone, turned into burning debris. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death." Escort missions revealed another P-47 advantage: endurance. While German fighters consumed fuel rapidly at combat power, the big American radios could cruise efficiently at high altitude. Thunderbolts could remain with the bombers for hours, rotating top cover while retaining enough fuel for combat and return. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived in spring 1944 to take over long-range escort duties, P-47 units increasingly shifted to ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal. The transition accelerated in April 1944 as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine guns proved devastating against ground targets. Standard armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles, while the sheer volume of fire obliterated soft targets instantly. A 2-second burst delivered 160 half-inch projectiles into a truck-sized area. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that turned the P-47 into a true multi-role monster. The D-25 variant carried 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, equal to the load of early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket launch rails for 10 5-inch HVR rockets, each equivalent to a 105 mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 attacks firsthand. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming. Then the hammering of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles turned into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect was devastating. We called them Jabos, fighter bombers, but these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered just how completely the balance of air power had shifted. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable shield over the beaches. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jägerschwader 21, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches on D-Day, later reported that the sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. In the weeks following the landings, P-47s systematically dismantled German movement during daylight hours. The statistics were staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles. The Wehrmacht was forced to move exclusively at night, crippling its ability to respond to Allied advances. The Germans tried everything to stem the Thunderbolt onslaught: reinforced armor, heavier anti-aircraft concentrations, new camouflage concepts. Nothing worked. The P-47's marriage of speed, armor, and overwhelming firepower made it almost untouchable. Even the feared 88mm flak, deadly against high-flying bombers, struggled to track the fast-moving Thunderbolts at treetop height. While the aircraft devastated Europe, the P-47 was simultaneously proving itself in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from New Guinea, found that the Thunderbolt's qualities, range, toughness, and firepower, were perfectly suited to the vast distances of the Pacific War. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the group, developed tactics unique to the theater. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, shooting down 6 himself in a single mission, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor. Japanese pilots, accustomed to battling nimble but fragile American fighters, were stunned by the Thunderbolt's brutality. Saburo Sakai, who encountered P-47s over New Guinea, later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could tear apart a P-40 with a few hits, seemed useless. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that ripped aircraft to pieces." The P-47N, developed specifically for the Pacific, incorporated enlarged, wet, wings holding 93 gallons each, extending range to 2,350 miles. This variant would escort B-29s to Japan, completing the transformation of the short-legged 1943 Thunderbolt into a true long-range powerhouse. Perhaps the greatest vindication of the P-47's evolution came in its confrontations with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, capable of 540 miles per hour, should have been untouchable. Yet Thunderbolt pilots discovered 2 situations where the jets were vulnerable: during takeoff and landing, and when caught by a high-speed dive from altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to down a Me-262 with a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, his Thunderbolt reached nearly 500 miles per hour, enough to overtake the jet in level flight. The Me-262 pilot, confident in his speed advantage, never noticed the diving P-47 until Meyer opened fire at 400 yards. His combat report read, "The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The concentrated fire of 8.50 caliber guns proved far more effective against jets than we anticipated." By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were deployed to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection boosting power to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, these final Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, fast enough to intercept jets under the right conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron, shot down 2 Me-262s in March 1945. His tactical summary emphasized firepower over speed. "The jets are faster, but they can't turn and they can't take punishment. One good burst and they come apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down to attack the bombers. That's when we get them." The ultimate demonstration of American industrial power came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day attack on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, many flown by their last veteran pilots, struck Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the initial attack hit hard. 22 Thunderbolts were destroyed on the ground. A captured German pilot, brought before the American commanders, pointed toward the burning fighters and sneered, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brookings' reply became legend throughout the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already clearing wreckage and preparing hard stands. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk vanished. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47D-40s filled the flight line, ferried in from depots in England. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in the attack, many of them irreplaceable instructors and leaders. The Americans lost 134 aircraft across all airfields, all replaced within a week. The scale of American production revealed a truth the Axis could no longer deny: the war in the air would be decided by numbers as much as by pilots. Over the course of the conflict, Republic aviation completed 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts, more than any other U.S. fighter type. At the height of output, the assembly lines at Farmingdale, New York, rolled a fully finished Thunderbolt out the door every single hour, day and night. Meanwhile, the new plant in Evansville, Indiana, carved from open fields only months earlier, was turning out 500 aircraft a month by 1944. Building a single P-47D required an industrial choreography of staggering complexity: 65,000 separate components, 8 miles of wiring, a literal ton of aluminum, and hundreds of pounds of rubber. Its massive radial engine alone contained over 2,000 precision machine parts, each fitted to tolerances far tighter than pre-war standards. Yet the American workforce, many of them women who had never stepped inside a factory before 1941, produced these machines with a consistency that astonished inspectors. The logistical effort behind the aircraft was just as overwhelming. A single Thunderbolt sortie consumed 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and with hundreds of P-47s flying daily, monthly consumption soared past 10 million rounds. Plants like the Lake City Arsenal in Missouri produced ammunition by the tens of millions, every cartridge built to microscopic precision to ensure flawless reliability in combat. Fuel needs rose just as dramatically. A P-47 burned through 100 gallons per hour in cruise and tripled that when water injection was engaged during combat. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone required over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel every month, all of it hauled across the Atlantic in tankers produced by the same vast American industrial machine. Yet the true force multiplier was not hardware, but the pilots who flew it. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots per year, more than Germany trained across the entire conflict. A new Thunderbolt pilot arrived in theater with roughly 400 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice, formation training, instrument instruction, and a deep technical understanding of their aircraft. German pilots entering combat at the same time often had fewer than 100 total flight hours, a brutal mismatch. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts recalled arriving in Europe in late 1944 with a logbook full of training and a head full of procedures. He had already fired thousands of practice rounds, flown mock combats, and studied real gun camera footage. "On my first mission," he said, "I wasn't guessing. I knew exactly what the aircraft could do, and what the enemy's couldn't." The Germans recognized this imbalance. In March 1945, Oberleutnant Joseph Priller, the same man who had once laughed at the Thunderbolt as a lumbering brute, gave a private interview admitting that the P-47 had become the finest fighter-bomber in existence. A machine whose reliability, firepower, and sheer numbers created an insurmountable problem. "They lose 10 and build 20, he lamented. "We lose 1, and it is gone forever." By spring 1945, the Luftwaffe was a force in name only. Fuel shortages kept aircraft on the ground, experienced pilots were gone, and airfields lay shattered. Those few new pilots who did reach combat faced impossible odds. Feldwebel Klaus Brechner flew only a single mission in April 1945. He lasted 12 seconds. 4 P-47s dropped on us from above, he recalled. "I turned as hard as I could, but they were already firing. My aircraft disintegrated around me. In the parachute, I watched my entire squadron die in less than a minute. Fear of the Thunderbolt became a medical condition among German airmen. Doctors called it Jabo fever, fighter bomber fever. Even hardened veterans felt their stomachs tighten at the distant rumble of P-47 engines. On the ground, soldiers dove for cover at the first hint of the Thunderbolt's growl, knowing that survival often came down to seconds. The final statistics were beyond grim. In Europe alone, Thunderbolts destroyed 3,752 enemy aircraft in the air and 3,315 on the ground, numbers that illustrated not just battlefield dominance but the systematic collapse of German air power. The scale of destruction wrought by the P-47 Thunderbolt was staggering. Tens of thousands of enemy vehicles, railway cars, locomotives, trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn transports were obliterated across both Europe and the Pacific. In the air, the results were equally devastating: hundreds of Japanese and German aircraft destroyed, both in combat and on the ground, alongside countless ships, barges, and military installations. The 9th Air Force, predominantly equipped with Thunderbolts, flew over 213,000 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of ordnance, unleashed 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and fired 60,000 rockets. In aerial engagements, P-47 units maintained a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, while suffering the lowest losses of any Allied fighter-bomber squadron. Behind these numbers lay the human toll. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 28,000 pilots to the concentrated firepower of the Thunderbolt, each representing irreplaceable training and experience. By war's end, the average German pilot had barely 30 hours of combat experience, while a typical P-47 pilot had over 200 hours, fully versed in tactics, gunnery, and formation operations. Captured German intelligence files, reviewed at Oberursel, revealed the changing assessment of the P-47 throughout the war. April 1943, viewed as a lumbering, underarmed aircraft, inferior to German fighters in all aspects except dive speed. Minimal threat. December 1943, recognized for exceptional high-altitude performance and structural resilience. Firepower becoming a serious concern. Significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944, established dominance as a fighter-bomber. Devastating against both air and ground targets, nearly impossible to destroy. Critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945, unquestioned as the premier fighter-bomber of the war. Firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. German pilots could not survive direct engagements. Decades later, during a 1985 reunion in Phoenix, Arizona, former Luftwaffe ace General Adolf Galland reflected on the P-47's impact. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, he admitted. "We laughed at the Thunderbolt, thinking it was a slow, oversized fighter. But it was a machine built for war, designed around firepower, survivability, and production. The Americans understood that in a war of attrition, numbers and resilience win. I flew a captured P-47 after the war and realized its power, speed, and handling were extraordinary. Every part overbuilt, over-engineered. Its guns, once you heard them, you never forgot the sound. Many of my friends heard it for the last time." The aircraft's engineering was as impressive as its combat record. Wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, the engine mount endured 12 G-forces, and all control cables were doubled with automatic backups. Its guns were fed by 8 independent ammunition boxes, each with 425 rounds, electrically boosted to prevent jams, individually heated to prevent freezing, and capable of adjustable convergence between 150 and 400 yards. Even after the war, German veterans acknowledged that the P-47's dominance came not from superior pilot skill, but from overwhelming firepower and industrial capacity. Where German fighters might have excelled in maneuverability or cannon range, P-47s created a dense, probability cloud of bullets that guaranteed hits even with imperfect aim. A typical 2-second burst would unleash at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, enough to guarantee destruction. The ammunition itself was a marvel: delayed action, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that penetrated before igniting, burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, capable of igniting aluminum airframes. The P-47 did not merely defeat enemy aircraft, it redefined the rules of aerial combat, turning industrial might into a lethal, unstoppable weapon. German 20mm cannon shells, though heavier, often detonated on impact, producing dramatic effects but sometimes leaving the target largely intact. The P-47 Thunderbolt, in contrast, was the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever built for mass production. With an empty weight of 10,000 pounds, it outweighed some twin-engine aircraft, yet its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine delivered more raw power than entire bomber formations from the previous conflict. Its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns unleashed firepower greater than an infantry platoon, yet these massive machines were produced by the thousands, flown by teenagers barely out of school, and maintained under the harshest combat conditions by mechanics trained in a matter of weeks. In less than 2 years, German pilots' laughter transformed into terror. The once mocked flying milk bottles became the most feared presence in the Luftwaffe's skies. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks spoke of the Thunderbolt with reverent caution decades after the war. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D rests among other legendary fighters. The placard lists its specifications and battle honors, but the true story is told by a small display, spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing the FW-190 disintegrating under fire. Beneath it, a quote from an anonymous German pilot's 1945 interrogation reads, "We laughed when we first saw them, clumsy, heavy American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to. They simply aimed their guns, and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of ridicule and emerged as a weapon of annihilation. Its 8 synchronized machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, raining relentless fire from high altitude to ground level. By April 1943, German pilots mocked it. By May 1945, there were no pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken. The sky belonged to America. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. See you in the next video.